Hello, and welcome back to Crime Labs. Today, we will be covering the survival story of Kara Robinson. If you would like to hear more information about this case, please visit the Cola City Crime Podcast in the description below. Can you remember what it was like to be 15 years old on summer break? To me, those times were always the highlight of my year. Going to summer pool parties, hanging out with friends almost every day, eating ice cream when it was super hot out, tanning on the beach, and just enjoying the sunshine and the freedom to do what felt like whatever you want. Well, for West Columbia, South Carolina native Kara Robinson Chamberlain, the summer of 2002 would be one that she would never forget. June 24th, Kara and her best friend Heather were hanging out at Heather's parents' house to prepare for a fun day at the lake. Before deciding to leave, they wanted to ask Heather's mom if anything needed to be done around the home before they went for their day of fun. Heather's mom was working, so she made a quick phone call to her, and all she asked them to do before leaving was to water the plants out front, so Kara offered to take care of them while Heather jumped in the shower. Kara, in her pajamas, went to water the plants. While outside, she said she noticed a green Pontiac Firebird drive toward the exit of the neighborhood, and then shortly after that, she noticed the car turn around and head back in, driving slowly up to Heather's house. The man behind the wheel decided to pull into the driveway, get out of the car, and approach Kara watering the plants. He was wearing a tucked-in button-down shirt and a baseball cap. Kara recalls that he was a middle-aged, nice-looking guy with dark hair and a goatee. When he approached her, he said, "I have some magazines, and I saw y'all outside, so I wanted to give these to you. Is your mom or dad home?" And Kara responded, "No, this is not my house. This is my friend Heather's house." So the man asked if her mom was home, and when Kara said no, that she was out, he responded, "Well, okay, I can just give them to you, and you can just leave them for her." So Kara, being the polite young woman she was, agreed to take them inside. The man stepped forward to hand her the magazines with his left hand, and once he got closer, Kara realized that he had a gun in his right hand, which he proceeded to hold to the back of her neck. Kara remembers a feeling of terror come over her, but instantly her survival instincts kicked in, and she knew she needed to do what he asked of her. There was a 50-gallon plastic storage container in the trunk, and he told her to get inside and curl up into fetal position. He took the lid and laid it over the top, not quite sealing it so she had airflow. He closed the trunk and drove away from Heather's home, leaving her to come outside looking for her best friend, and she was nowhere to be found. The man made a stop before getting to his apartment. After driving for about 10 to 15 minutes, somewhere on the side of the road, he opened the lid of the container to speak to her for the first time since he grabbed her. He said, "I'm going to tie you up, and I'm going to gag you," and reminded her that he had a gun. She knew she needed to go along with anything he said and make sure he didn't think she would try anything. He proceeded to restrain and gag her, put her back into the container, and this time he sealed it tight. Kara felt the car stop, and then felt the container being jerked from the car and carried for a bit before she was suddenly dumped on the floor. He looked at her directly and said to her with a weird smile, "Do everything you're told, and I won't have to hurt you," as she shakily climbed out and removed her gag. Her legs were numb, and the first few steps were wobbly, but she maintained her composure as best she could. Immediately, once she was out of the container, she began to take note of small details around his apartment, like the magnets on the fridge with a dentist's office number, a hairbrush with long strands of red hair entwined, and small animals in cages like a guinea pig and a lizard. He had her walk over to the couch. This is where Kara would get her first real look at her abductor. A white man, probably around 40 years old, brown eyes, a little heavy set with dark brown hair, and a little salt and pepper stubble on his double chin. She burned the image into her mind and knew that she would be able to identify him even if he was in a crowded room. Then her abductor would begin to assess her, and Kara reminded herself to try and be polite and learn as much about him as she could. She asked about his animals, and somewhere in that conversation, it led to asking him if he was in the military, and she discovered that he was discharged from the Navy. He even spoke back to her, and she claims he was seemingly polite. He had a pad and pencil in hand and began to prod her for answers. She said, "He asked me a bunch of questions and was writing down answers. My name and whose house I was at, and if I had any previous sexual experience, if I had a boyfriend, and wrote it all down." This set of questioning triggered a little more panic inside because Kara knew that inevitably the worst would happen. People don't kidnap young girls and not sexually assault them, so I knew that was coming. Over the course of the next 18 hours, she would be repeatedly sexually assaulted with a knife and gun just within reach. About 8 hours after her abduction, he turned on the local news to see if there was any coverage, but there was nothing. He said, "Well, no one misses you." He would continually tell her that he was going to let her go and said, "Then it's your choice what to do. You can go to the police, and you can always be the girl who was raped." And those words would stick with Kara. It stuck in her mind that there was going to be this stigma assigned to her, the girl who was kidnapped, the girl who was raped. Kara said, "There was one point that I definitely lost it and had a panic attack. He told me he had to go make a phone call, and at that point, he put me back into the container, and he said, 'You've been good so far, basically, so if you promise that you aren't going to scream, I won't gag you or anything.'" She recalls this moment vividly and said, "He put me in there, and at that point, the lid was mostly on, but I started to basically hyperventilate and have a panic attack. He came back in there and he said, 'What's the problem?' And I said, 'I can't breathe.' And he said, 'Okay, well, I'll leave the lid open as long as you don't make any noise.' And he did, and then he went back and continued his phone call." Can you guess who he was on the phone with? His wife. He put the handcuffs back on Kara's wrists, and on one end of the bed frame there was a rope with a C-clamp attached to it, which he used to clamp her cuffs on for extra security. Her hands were stretched up, and her right leg was also restrained to the other end of the bed, and he said, "Okay, we're going to sleep." But it wouldn't be separate. He would sleep right next to her in the same bed, and shortly after he finally fell asleep, and so did Kara. In the early hours of the next morning, Kara realized that if there was any time to escape from his clutches, it was right now. The man was still snoring away, but she knew that it would be really difficult to remain quiet and slip away without him noticing. The first thing she needed to do was get her hands out of the C-clamp, so she tried to unscrew it, but it would be unsuccessful, so she relied on her teeth to get it undone with her hands still in the cuffs. She was then able to wiggle down to her ankle and detach the leg restraint from the bed frame and slowly slid out of bed silently. I got my clothes back on, and I went into the living room, went to the door, and at the front door, right beside the door, there was like a coat closet, and it had one of those accordion-style doors on it, and it was metal, and so you know, that's like a noisy door. And there was stuff, like the vacuum cleaner, and the Rubbermaid container was also right there in the little foyer area, and so I moved the container, I pushed the vacuum in, and unlocked the door. And I knew that the door was going to make noise whenever I closed that accordion door. So basically, in one motion, I closed the door and opened the other one, and his bedroom window looked out onto the front door, basically. So I just knew he was going to wake up when he heard that, and I knew he was going to be able to see me, so I just did it as fast as I could, and I ran. She had an overwhelming feeling that the man would wake up and shoot her through the window, but she was out and could feel the sunshine on her skin, the feeling of freedom once again. Kara quickly scanned the parking lot looking for anyone to help her, and she saw a car that she ran out in front of waving her handcuffed arms. She approached the driver's side and told them she had been kidnapped by the man in the apartment and pointed to it. The driver, who was a middle-aged man, and the passenger, a younger man, of course, were shocked to hear something like that, but she requested to be taken straight to the police department. Unfortunately, that statement would ring true for Kara at first. The men took her to a Richland County Sheriff's substation, and she recalls that she felt the deputy she spoke to wasn't believing anything she was saying. She even made it a point to wave her wrist with the handcuff still attached to it, but it wasn't registering with him. She said, "I just felt like he didn't believe me." It was definitely pretty infuriating, because I was like, here I am, I've actually done what I set out to do, I escaped, and now I'm in an area that should be a safe zone, and I'm being treated like I'm lying about this. But the deputy made a phone call to Kara's mother to let her know that her missing daughter was found and she was safe now. The investigators told her they were going to put her in a car real quick, and they were going to head over to the apartments to see if they could find the guy, rather than take Kara to receive medical care or a rape kit. Kara had noticed the long strands of red hair tangled in a hairbrush inside the apartment, so she knew a woman had to have lived there. The property manager was riding around the parking lot in a golf cart when Kara and the police got there, so since she was unable to point out the apartment specifically, the investigator stopped him and shared the information that Kara had relayed to them to see if the manager might know who this man was and which apartment he lived in. Kara's impeccable memory saved her. The manager immediately knew who they were talking about, and he was able to lead investigators to his door. The man shared the apartment with his wife, but when they knocked on the door, they would not get an answer. Her abductor had woken up and knew he had to get the hell out of there, so he was gone. But with the vital information that Kara had provided and the help of the property manager going through some records, they were able to identify him. His name was Richard Ivanitz. Does this name ring a bell? Richard was a Columbia, South Carolina native. He graduated from Irmo High School in 1980, and he would go on to join the Navy and serve for 8 years before being honorably discharged. He had a record, which includes exposing himself to a 15-year-old girl in Orange Park, Florida, where he masturbated in front of her. After his arrest, a month after the incident, he pled no contest and was only sentenced to 3 years probation. He was also suspected of an abduction and rape in 1994, as well as another rape in 1995. Just 1 year later, in September of 1996, Richard abducted a 16-year-old girl named Sophia Silva from her front yard in Virginia, and sadly, her decomposed body was found a month later in a creek. In 1997, he abducted sisters Kristen and Katie, who were 15 and 12, from their front lawn after school. He sexually assaulted them, strangled them, and dumped their bodies in a river, which were found 5 days later. So now we know that we are dealing with a methodical serial killer in Kara's case. He knew what he was doing, and he had done it before. So can we really believe him when he said that he would let her go? We don't, and neither does law enforcement. Police quickly obtained a warrant and were able to search his apartment. When searching the apartment, they found a metal footlocker which contained some trophies. There was a newspaper article from Virginia describing where they found the two sisters' bodies in the river, which caused the investigators to call the FBI, and the manhunt ensued. Investigators contacted Richard's family to attempt to locate him, and they were absolutely shocked to hear the news, but agreed to meet. One of his sisters spoke to the detectives privately and provided some information that might help them find her brother. He had reached out to her and told her he was in a motel, so immediately a team was dispatched out. They got to the motel room, but again, he was nowhere to be found. They then received a hit from his cell phone provider that he was in Jacksonville, Florida, which then triggered a high-speed chase. Police were prepared with a line of spikes laid out on the highway when they caught up to him in Sarasota, where then he got out of his car and pulled out a gun. He absolutely would not comply with police demands, so they released a K-9 unit to his car. Richard took that gun, stuck it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. Once Kara and her family got the news that Richard had taken his own life, a wave of disappointment washed over her. She was upset and said, "I wanted him to look at me across a courtroom and know that choosing me, that was his biggest mistake." At this point, Kara's case was essentially closed, but the information investigators gathered from his apartment, specifically the newspaper article, opened up a full-blown investigation for the unsolved cases of the other children. There was a $150,000 reward for information leading to who the 3 girls' murderer was, and Kara was awarded that money and was able to meet their families. This meeting was so important to her, knowing that without her, those families might never know what happened to their daughters. Sheriff Lott offered Kara a position in the police department. Initially, she was studying to be a teacher, but since she enjoyed working at the sheriff's office so much, she decided to shift into something that would merge her two passions together. She went to the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy and eventually became a school resource officer and an investigator on child abuse and sexual assault cases. Kara eventually left law enforcement behind to start a family with her husband, Joe Chamberlain, and she now has 2 boys. She has never forgotten about her abduction and chooses every day to live not like a victim, but the survivor that she is. In 2019, she participated in an interview with another fellow survivor, Elizabeth Smart, and was in a Lifetime special titled Smart Justice, the Jamie Kloss case, which also featured 5 other survivors who support Jamie, a teen girl from Wisconsin who escaped from her captor in 2019. This experience made Kara realize that she had a bigger purpose in life, and she felt healed sitting on that couch talking to the other women because they knew firsthand what she had gone through. Kara's story has been featured in many news articles and outlets, including a true crime documentary on Oxygen released in 2021 called Escaping Captivity: The Kara Robinson Story, which was produced by Elizabeth Smart. Kara also has a website where she shares her story and hopes to encourage other survivors that they can thrive after an abduction and assault. This is just a short list of things that Kara has worked on over the years, and she continues to advocate for victims like herself. She has a TikTok where she provides advice for recovering from trauma, self-help tips, and practical tips on how to escape from someone like Richard Ivanitz. The world is a better place with a person like Kara in it. Tune in to the Cola City Crime Podcast and the links in the description to hear more about this case. Thanks for watching Crime Labs. Please visit our channel to watch our playlists.